Welcome to TGS, Transform, Grow, Succeed. This podcast is about your work as a caring professional and the ideas we can share to elevate and expand what we do to ensure that all those we serve get the best of what we have to offer. My name is Dr. Tim Gravoy. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the Executive Director of TGS Educational Consulting. I'm excited to introduce Jason Ablin to the show. Jason Ablin is the author of The Gender Equation in Schools: How to Create Equity and Fairness for All Students. With over 30 years of experience in education, he has served as a teacher, academic director, principal, and head of school. He holds national certification in leadership mentoring from the National Association of Elementary School Principals, mentors new leaders throughout the country, and is the director of American Jewish University's Mentor Teacher Certification Program. He currently consults with schools, leading training and workshops on gender equity, positive faculty engagement, and school culture. Jason, did I get that right?
You got it all right, Tim.
Excellent. I love it when it happens the first time. Well, fantastic. So, Jason, I invited you on the show today to talk about gender and how implicit biases that are related to gender might show up in discipline data in schools. Jason, just from your perspective and your just experience working with this issue, is there an equity issue related to gender that shows up in schools? And how do school leaders typically know that is happening?
Okay, Tim, so those are really great questions, both of those, and we're going to try to tackle them separately. One thing I will say is that I'm going to suggest to you something a little radical here, which is that we don't have discipline issues in schools that aren't gender related. They're all gender related. And in fact, that's what a lot of the data shows us. Before I launch into my diatribe and launch into what I know about the research, though, what I'd love to turn back to you is maybe giving me some context about what you are thinking about when you talk about discipline, about how you contextualize it.
Sure. So first, I just love what you say. Just the idea is actually we don't have a single discipline issue in our schools that isn't related to gender, and I think that's going to be a delicious statement to explore and unpack just a bit, right? Especially as you know, if we have two white cisgendered males having this conversation on its own is just, to be honest, a little bit hilarious. So I'm really interested to see how we unpack and explore this a bit. But what you're asking me is why am I interested in this issue at all, really? Like what context, what data, what anything suggests to me that this is something we should talk about? Well, to be honest, most of the work that I do is with positive behavior intervention and support with schools, and tons of that work really is with discipline data. And a lot of that discipline data we explore through the lens of equity. And one of the things that I find all of the time is this really persistent and exceptionally common problem with every single school I work with except for one. And that one school that isn't this way has no clue why it is that it's this way. But generally speaking, when we talk about like risk ratios between male identifying and female identifying students, and and of course we don't track anything really related to our trans or non-binary learners at all. We're still very stuck in a binary way of talking about gender anyway in terms of this issue, but at least is related to that gender binary bias, which is already icky to talk about. Male identifying students are apparently as much as 8 times naughtier than female identifying students in schools, right, unless we're talking about dress code, in which case female identifying students are about usually 10 to 12% naughtier in terms of their dress code than male students are. And it's just persistently true, persistently consistent with every single school that I've worked with, and seems like it should be absolutely unacceptable. And yet it seems to be is just accepted as the price of admission when we talk about school discipline data. So that's really my interest in exploring the issue.
Yeah. And I think it's a beautiful framing. I mean, you've covered about 80% of what we could cover in this conversation. So it's
80%. That's like exactly. Minus. We did okay.
Excellent. We're going to go a little deeper into those subjects that you raised. So I think that that's a really important part of this. And I think one of the things we want to look at is discipline as being kind of the losing proposition already inside of schools. In other words, when we've gotten to the point of already talking about discipline, there have been 6 or 7 missteps that have already taken place along the way that lead us to talk about the question of discipline in that sense. So I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to give you two contexts for this. The first thing I'm going to bring to it is the lens that we bring into classrooms and the construction of classrooms that actually leads us down the road to have the kind of discipline problems that we have and we pull our hair out about with students, right? So I work with everything from early childhood programs all the way through 12th grade. Okay. I work across the entire spectrum. And I also work with parents because parents are super frustrated with this issue. And as you already alluded to in a certain way, one of the groups I deal with a lot when I'm talking to parents is parents of early childhood kids who are persistently getting kicked out of school. Okay. They are 4.5 times more likely to be expelled or suspended by the time they're 5 years old than girls are. Right. And you already mentioned, thank you for raising this. Most of our research is very much in the context of this binary understanding. There's no question about that. And most of the research that's been done over the last 60 to 70 years has been in that context. It's been in the context of the binary. That's why we talk that way, I think. And of course, my feeling is, of course, we're dealing with gender as a variation, as a type of experimentation that kids do in school, that they're playing with gender identity all the time, that they're working through gender identities. And most of the time, what the adults are doing are kind of impressing upon them a gender construct that does not necessarily always fit into who they are and, you know, how they see themselves. So we're going to start with 2-year-olds, Tim. Okay. We're going to get right into 2-year-olds, and we're going to start with what this looks like for 2-year-olds. And I'm going to give you a little story of what a lot of the early childhood data looks like before we even get into the question of discipline. You're going to hear the issue of discipline at the very end of the story. Okay. Right? So I'm a teacher in an early childhood classroom. I'm working with 2- and 3-year-olds. And typically speaking, what I have in those environments are what are called the public spaces of the school, of the classroom, and then what I have what are constructed the private spaces of the classroom. And when you walk into any classroom that's an early childhood classroom, you go, oh yeah, I see it. I see all this unfolding right in front of me. The public space is often this big open space where often circle time takes place, where we have the blocks and the building sets that are put out because they need a lot of room. And the private spaces are literally created as such, and they're kind of sequestered. Right? So what we see in those spaces is often the dress-up area, the kitchen, the puppet area, all of these types of constructivist spaces that we want kids to participate in. And I've learned along the line, after 15 years of doing this work, that kitchens actually play a very important educational purpose inside of early childhood centers. It's not just a gender construct when we see it in there. Very important. But what ultimately begins to happen is something very interesting. The teacher sets a series of rules or standards inside of these early childhood classrooms, right? And all of a sudden, the kids start having these subset of standards or rules, which are often in contradiction to the rules that are set by the teacher. So the teacher might say, we're all going to collaborate in the space. Everyone gets equal share. We want to be fair to everyone. And the boys come into the public space and they say, that's very nice, but we're going to set all the rules in here. Okay. So they start setting up all of these rules for the public space. They start saying who can play here, what kind of games can be played, who's in charge, what the configuration of the games are. They're doing all sorts of rule setting in this space.
Wait a second. Have you not observed girls also doing the same?
Okay. So that's a very interesting point, right? So what happens is that girls find themselves engaged initially in conflict with boys. And then what happens ultimately is the girls who no longer want to deal with the conflict of the public space end up gravitating toward the private spaces of the classroom. They end up going into those very binary aligned spaces. And then they set up a whole different set of rules in those spaces. And some of the boys who also do not want to deal with the kind of energy that is in that public space, which they can find too physical or too disruptive, they find themselves also moving into that private space and playing games with the girls, right? The problem with this is it sets up a whole series of conflicts before even the teacher is able to establish good norms inside the classroom. So I'm going to give you an example of how that works itself out. Teachers all of a sudden will say, okay, it's time for circle time. All the kids start coming to the rug, right? This is after the boys have already established this kind of extensive use of space. They come into circle time. The girls come and sit down. Most of the boys do, but then a couple of the boys say, I don't want to do this right now. This is not what I want to do. And they start wandering around the classroom, and the teacher has to get into constant conflict with them about getting into this circle time and start playing by the rules. But the boys have a point here. The boys are saying, wait a minute, I've been playing by rules that we established in the classroom since the very beginning of the year. This is our public space. That might be in contradiction to what the teachers say, but at the same time, we were setting rules along. Why do I have to follow your rules? The girls get frustrated. Other students get frustrated because the boys are keeping, let's say, reading from going on or certain activities that go on in circle time. And the boys get into real conflict with the teacher in the classroom. They go head to head over this question of rules. And all of a sudden, we find two interesting things happening when kids come home. Mm-hmm. So when kids come home, we find that girls are often, a majority of the time, complaining about the boys in their classroom, while the boys come home and start complaining about their relationship with adults. Mm-hmm. Okay?
So essentially, sounds like you're describing is that almost cosmically or organically, the patriarchy just recreates itself in a pre-K classroom without us really doing much about it.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Absolutely. It's extraordinary, right? Mm-hmm. And I've walked into schools, very traditional schools, religious schools, and I've walked into places that consider themselves very woke, mm-hmm. and I'll see all this kind of stuff going on. I'll see all of these patterns going on, even with everyone having different attitudes and thinking. And it's a very example of what we call implicit bias, where people are bringing all of these kind of constructs into the environments in which they work. The other issue, which we cannot avoid, which is a really significant part of this equation of gender, is that many studies have shown that both at home and at school, the adult figures in these environments feel as if the way they address discipline issues with boys are different than the way they address these discipline issues with girls. There's a different tone that's taken. There's a kind of an aggressiveness that can also be often taken with boys. Girls are treated with much more soft, lowered language, less aggression, and boys are just, addressed in a much more aggressive way in this sense. And all of a sudden, we have boys who are wondering why that they're being talked to in this way, why they're being addressed in this way. Why all of a sudden they're receiving this kind of discipline, but girls are receiving a different kind of discipline. And I'm not saying that one is more effective than the other. I'm just saying it's very gender aligned in thinking about what a boy is going to listen to when he gets into a disciplinary issue at school, right? From an adult.
And so that's a really interesting thing to think about too, because I'll bet you, and I know that my first few years as a classroom teacher, if you had suggested that I speak to boys differently than I speak to girls, I would have said, no, absolutely not. And now I know that if you had videotaped 6 years of, me teaching third grade, it's unquestionably true. And what I'm
with you, Tim.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm all on board.
Yeah, exactly.
I've
right?
seen it.
And without question, it's just one of those things where I'll often, but then the other thing I'll often hear too, when I have these conversations, when I'm presenting like gender equity data and in terms of like the outcome part, right? You talked about the 5 or 6 steps that have been missed along the way by the time something actually gets recorded as a disciplinary data point. And I can't wait to talk about that some more, but like when I'm showing that you've got essentially boys that are apparently 8 to 9 times or 8 to 12 times, even at some schools, naughtier than the girls, at least in terms of the
whatever that means, right? The naughtiness, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Whatever it is, whatever, except for dress code. I mean, that's always the one that splips.
And we'll talk about that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Like when what I'll also hear is, well, that's just the way boys are. Like I don't know that I can't believe that that's true. And also believe what I believe to be true about gender, and that's just a lot to square, right? So there's these, so I'm wondering kind of when you bring that to teachers' attention, the like, hey, you're observing a classroom, you're doing some consulting work with a school, and you're in the classrooms watching it happen, and you say, you know what, the way that you speak to your boys about sharing these things is different than the way that you speak to girls about sharing those things. What are some common kind of reactions that you might hear often?
So, and it's a great question, because what you're contextualizing here is something that we all fall prey to. And it took me years and years to really kind of unpack for myself, which is that so much of my mental energy was going into having these essentialist arguments be at the forefront of how I saw gender, right? Boys are just being boys, girls are just more, less aggressive. They're more, placating than boys are. And all of it's absolute nonsense, right? It's all constructivist. It's all constructivist. And we build these models, and then there's self-fulfilling models that are built along the way. So one of the interesting things that I go through with teachers is a sense of how well do you know your students, right? That's one of the things that I really want to ask a question about, because when they're raising their voice with boys, one of the things that I really want to get an understanding of is how well that teacher knows that boy who she happens to be disciplining at that moment. And what I'll find is that teachers are they fool themselves a little bit. They think they know their students really well, and they pride themselves on that. So you have to walk on very, around that very soft shoes when you talk about these things. But the reality is they don't really know their students so well, and they need to do some things to understand their students well. When I would give, let's say, middle school students or high school students, I would work with boy groups, and I would also work in contexts where we're working on gender and issues in schools. I would give the students questionnaires about what's your favorite class? How do you describe your favorite teacher? What makes up your favorite teacher? The ironic aspect of this, Tim, is that 80% of the boys that I would speak to, whenever I would ask this question, they would say to me, that teacher gets me. That teacher knows me really well. And I think that teachers have to do a much better job of getting to know these kids and actually what works with them individually that is not going to make them default into a gender standpoint when they're trying to have a conversation with them about something disruptive behavior that's going on in class. And often they default into very heavy, aggressive language, getting upset. There's a lot of clapping that goes on. I don't know if you've noticed this in classrooms, elementary classrooms, where boys will get kind of rowdy or out of control, and all of a sudden teachers are clapping at them. They're making loud noises at them. And they don't do this with the girls. And the girls are being as disruptive. They're sitting there talking. They're not listening to the teacher. They're distracting other students, but they're not being clapped at. And I said, and I'll say to teachers, what do you think? What's the reason that you think you're clapping at that kid? And she'll say, because I need to get his attention. Right?
I mean, that's one way. I suppose that's one way. And I think that's the thing too, is right. In education, we're very often choosing among like 1,000 ways to be right, 1,000 correct ways to do something. And often that choosing the most correct way is tricky. And I'm thinking that the whole idea of not knowing somebody, it seems to me pretty logical that if you don't really know somebody well, you're more likely to go to the thing that you know will be most effective. Whereas if you really do know somebody well, you're going to probably be more aware of other ways to get that person's attention, rather than kind of going to the most intensive, intervention that you can choose from here. And and I'm wondering, so you've had some survey data from male identifying students, from boys, and they're saying that my favorite teachers are the ones who know me. Does that change depending on how they perceive the gender of their teacher?
Well, that's really interesting. And what tends to happen with children in general as they get older is that young boys, and this is based on the work of Dr. Niobe Way at New York University, who's done extensive research on boys in particular and their relationships. But this also has to do with girls. And one of the things I say is that one of the things we allow for and encourage with girls is an ever increasing acceptance and validation of relational knowledge as they get older. So the more networking, the more web-based interactions they have with each other, the more relationships they create, we give them thumbs up and we tell them, that's wonderful. That's really terrific that you're doing that. And often when you talk to girls about the teachers who are important to them, what's interesting about it is they do not lean into that emotional, relational part as much because they have these vast networks already established. They feel supported already. They like certain teachers more than others, but they don't feel like it's so necessary. With the boys, what we have a tendency to do, and by the time they're 14 to 15 years old, and again, this is through very damaging and narrow constructed descriptions of masculinity and the way those, that sense is established for them, what we tend to do with boys is de-relationalize them. Mm-hmm. We say to them, it's better to be insensitive. It's better to be less connected to other people. It's better to see yourself as an individual on their own. We don't give them the sense of the collective. They move away from that as they get older. And we start seeing they start seeing those things as negative because they're categorized as girlish, mm-hmm. or, they'll say things like no homo, or that's gay, or they'll use that kind of language, begin to use that kind of language by the time they're 14 and 15 years old.
If not earlier, honestly.
Yeah, it really starts to begin middle school. But when you talk to middle school boys, one of the things they're still able to acknowledge is the importance of their friendships, mm-hmm. and how much their friendships have a positive impact on their mental health. Mm-hmm. And that's really what Dr. Naomi Way found out when she interviewed these kids over time. And so even with that awareness, the construction of masculinity is so powerful, mm-hmm. that by the time they're 14 to 15 years old, they're willing to give that up for this much more destructive sense of who they are as men, right? And young men, right, getting older. That's why I believe that when they talk about teachers, they talk about them in such a relational way, because they're starving for those kind of relationships and those kind of models in their lives. They're wanting it so badly that when a teacher takes a real interest in them and really knows them well, they'll do anything for that teacher. And those kids, right? They're the ones who say, I have Johnny in my class too, and he seems to be such a pleasure. I don't have any issues with him whatsoever. It happens
all the time when I'm working on individualized behavior support plans, because there's always that one teacher who just doesn't get what everyone else is talking about.
That's exactly right.
And kind of like what you're reminding me of is Pastor Chapman's kind of goofy, cheesy 5 love languages quiz. And kind of the joke with that is sort of like, hey, your love language is whatever you're not getting. And just sort of the way that you're talking about it being is that girls don't really talk about, how well their teachers know them. Not that they don't value it, but because for whatever reason, they're developing those supportive networks anyway and don't feel any social pressure to let go of that as they get older. Whereas boys may not have that and are kind of carefully taught not to have that. Right. And so value it even more when they receive it. Would that be kind of an accurate way of paraphrasing?
I think that's exactly what's going on with these boys. I think that's exactly the kind of energy that they're bringing to these surveys when we talk to them. They talk about, boys, I don't, typically I'm brought into the schools because, hey, they're saying, my child is, the children in our school, the boys are not acting appropriately. They're not treating the teachers well, all this kind of stuff. And all of a sudden I come in and I don't start with that conversation. I start with the conversation about like, what's raising your anxiety level, right? Mm-hmm. That's one of the things I talk to the boys about. And one of the things the boys tell me over and over again is that they feel like they're never good enough. They're never able to kind of meet up to other people's expectations. Mm-hmm. And the bar is constantly moving for them. Mm-hmm. And this is also, I think, very much the language of people who do not feel loved, mm-hmm. people who do not feel cared for. They feel like they have to constantly prove something and be admired all the time, when really what they're looking for is deep emotional relationships with other people that can make them feel calm and connected and engaged with the communities in which they're in. But the boys are very clear about it. The boys are very clear about how they feel about these issues. I do want to address something else, if you don't mind right now, which I think is important, which is this question of school policy.
You know what?
Which I think you alluded to before.
Let's take a quick break, because we covered a lot of ground.
Yes.
And so why don't we take a quick break, and then when we come back, let's actually take a look at then, just from a policy level, what might be some places to start. As you talked about kind of just the idea of how like the patriarchy just kind of reinvents itself by magic in our classrooms, kind of just due to, well, a lot of things we haven't talked about yet, but we probably should. But then, other times it's just how these kinds of inequities are codified in our policies. So, let's go ahead. Let's take a quick break. And then when we come back, let's take a look at the gender equity and school policy.
Correct.
Introducing the Gender Equation in Schools, How to Create Equity and Fairness for All Students by author Jason Ablin. Join Ablin as he examines the impact of gender bias in schools and its effect on our efforts to educate children. Through expert interviews, research, and relatable anecdotes, Jason Ablin sheds light on the challenges we face and provides practical takeaways for teachers and leaders striving for better outcomes. Throughout the reading, you can count on finding valuable strategies and stories that will empower you to create equity for all your students. Whether you're a teacher, administrator, DEI director, or homeschooling parent, this book equips you with step-by-step guides for facilitating faculty-wide conversations, writing unbiased learning reports, assessing gendered attitudes, and overall creating an inclusive classroom. Read The Gender Equation in Schools by Jason Ablin now on Amazon.com.
Well, welcome back. So, Jason, we've been talking about gender equity and school discipline, but really we haven't even gotten to the discipline part. Right now, we really just are just talking about really just the inequitable ways of doing things that happened from the get-go. And before break, you were saying, we probably should talk about just policy. And I'm wondering what you mean by that. Like, what are ways that school leaders might take a look at policy as a way of addressing gender inequity at school?
So I'm going to give you two examples. And one you've already mentioned. You mentioned early on, which I'm glad you did, which was about dress code.
Yep.
We're going to get to that. The one I'd like to talk about, though, is our policies and rules in schools about fighting,
okay,
which are very interesting when kids get into physical conflict with one another, okay, which is, of course, like, it's always very high on our list. I mean, everybody has a kind of concept about what happens when two kids get into a physical fight. And that about 85 to 90% of the time, that's two boys, right, who have gotten into some kind of physical fight. Now, what happens is, again, an example of how what's baked into the system is actually a gender system that tells us what to do, but actually sends very mixed messages to the students.
Okay.
So there was a lot of research done, both in Sweden and the United States, about reporting about fights that happened in schools and the way that administrators talked about the fights and then what actually happened as a result of the fight. So the conversation that takes place and what gets recorded in terms of documentation is that when two boys get into the fight, the language that's used is that boys are engaged in a normative form of emotional expression. Okay. That's what we talk about. It's boys being boys, and that this is how boys communicate with one another. It's contextualized as being direct. They're being direct when they get into a fight, okay? And when to unpack that a little bit, I can't think of any less a direct way to communicate what you're feeling or what you're thinking at a certain time than to punch someone in the face, okay? I can't. But of course, again, baked into those notions are very gendered ideas about what boys do, right? And what they do with each other. Mm-hmm. The ultimate response to what happens when boys get into a fight is it gets suspended or expelled from school because we have zero tolerance policies around these exact moments when boys are getting into fights. So on the one hand, boys are learning that somehow emotionally they're doing the right thing. They're engaged in the right kind of activities for themselves. But then as an institution, what they're expelled or suspended, and we're separating you from the very community that could support you to help you understand why you did this in the first place. Right? And so that's the dual message that comes up, but it's baked into the policy of the school and the way we go about this business, right? And it's a very gendered response. I talk a lot about getting rid of zero tolerance policies in school. I don't think they work. And I think we need other models. Restorative justice processes are one way of looking at it. But there are other ways in which schools contextualize this without having the need to suspend a kid, and at the same time, without telling boys that somehow they're doing a really great job of communicating emotionally, which they're not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that's the thing too, that most schools wouldn't say that. And yet it really, the logic of it kind of makes sense, that especially when I can't tell you the number of times that, when we take a look at like disparate impact by discipline, and the first thing that educators want to tell me, really smart, caring educators, they're not dumb people, they're not bad people, they're not ineffective at their jobs by any means, but the first things that we want to go to are the things that we've all been trained to go to. Like it is the same water we are all swimming in, that this is just the way that boys are, that when boys get into conflict, they solve it physically. When girls get into conflict, they don't solve it physically, they solve it with relational aggression. And really that's nonsense. Like every human being is capable of either of those things at any given time, but the idea of that, well, boys, you are fighting because that's what we expect of you. Also, we don't expect this. This is horrible behavior, is a very mixed message. And yeah, sure is not a very nuanced way of communicating feelings or setting boundaries, right? It's pretty, it lacks nuance, clearly does. And so it's just in thinking about one way to address disparate impact and discipline would be to say a lot less of the, okay, if this, then that, in terms of, incident to consequence.
Exactly. Especially when you're framing the incident as something somehow that's, that's okay. What's interesting when you look at the data, when girls get into fights, physical fights, and they can be quite aggressive inside of these physical fights, is that all of a sudden we have 6 therapists in the room.
Yeah.
We pathologize it immediately, right? There's something really wrong with these girls because they've gotten into these physical altercations. And there's less of a tendency to feel like we have to have these draconian policies at the end of the day. We need to work with them. They need therapy. They need this. They need that. We've got a little more sophisticated with boys, but with girls, when they get into a fight, it's like as if the entire house of cards has come down. Right? Something is really wrong. And we probably should be having somewhat more of a balanced response to boys in exactly the same way. That we should be suggesting to boys that something has really gone wrong, that you've had to get into a physical fight to solve a problem. Right?
Well, let's flip to dress code then. So that makes a lot of sense when it comes to physical fight, because that really tends to be one of the most common, disciplinary infractions. Some kind of physical aggression or minor physical contact or fighting tends to be pretty common. And most schools that I work with, if you disaggregate that by genders, it tends to be boys who generate by far, way more referrals for that than girls do. So then when it comes to dress code, why do you think it is then that girls, it's quite the opposite, that girls generate almost every single referral for dress code at almost every school that I work with?
Yeah. So again, and I'm going to tell you a gender story that frames this whole conversation, just like it does with the fighting, where I will speak to faculty members, for instance. And one of the things I'll say to faculty members is, tell me a gender story which really defines your own experience in school, something you remember from school. And from women, I often get 2 stories, right? One is about the short haircut bob they come back with in 4th grade, right? So mom decides to give their kid a really, short haircut. The girl comes back and all of a sudden there's all these gender questions that are coming up. Oh, are you a boy now? Or there's all this kind of energy that goes along with the haircut. They remember that really well. What happens also, the other story here all the time, is from the women who participated, particularly in certain kind of sports activities, and were cheerleaders in schools, okay? So on the one hand, they had cheerleading squads at football games and basketball games.
Mm-hmm.
And the girls would go into these environments basically, with 10% of their body covered, at any given time when they were going into it. Not only was it completely accepted as a kind of norm inside the community, but also the girls experienced, kind of forms of sexual harassment. They got catcalled from the stands. People would make comments to them. And basically what they were told was on a certain level that it was completely okay for them to be over-sexualized in this way when they were in their cheerleading outfit at a game or something like that.
And then what happens? Schools actually have outfits for cheerleaders that wouldn't pass their dress code during the school day.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's exactly the point. And what these faculty members tell me is then they would go into school and they would have a strap out of place, or they would be wearing skirts or pants that were just not low enough or whatever. And all of a sudden in school, the rules have totally changed. In school, there's something really wrong with them exposing their body. Even though the night before at the football game with 600 people at it, it was totally acceptable. But then they walk into school and they're being policed, right? That's a gender story, Tim. That's not about dress code. And what we do is we use dress codes as a way to enforce gender values and policies on young women, on girls and young women in schools, when what we're doing is we're not teaching them anything. We're not creating a more modest environment necessarily. What we're doing is actually, we're just perpetuating gender stories about women that they have to live with the rest of their lives and think badly about themselves in both of those environments many times, right?
So when you think about schools that have addressed this well, or have perhaps an equitable approach to dress code, what are some of the things that maybe they think about that change the way that the dress code gets talked about?
So it's really interesting because I have yet to see communities that have really cracked this issue, right? Okay. And one of the problems with the reason why they're having such trouble with it is because it's not just the school that's the issue; it's the outside society which is pressing so hard on these kids to be a certain way, to look a certain way, to express themselves in certain ways. We see this on TikTok, we see this on social media. And so the school is doing kind of this endless battle. And also the parents don't want to get into this battle, right? They don't want to have fights every day when a kid walks out the door in terms of what they're wearing, right? That becomes a very toxic environment for young girls when they're constantly trying, they're trying to express themselves a certain way. What I'm glad to hear from a lot of schools is that they have completely stopped with having teachers feel the necessity to talk to young girls about the way they're dressed. That seems to be going out quickly, right? And they're taking that off the plate for teachers. And I'm really glad that they're doing that, because a teacher's job should not be having to police gender inside their schools, right? So that's one solution that I think is really important. I think the other solution...
that solution honestly sounds like it boils down to two words: care less.
That's right.
But just don't care as much about this, which I think is kind of a neat thing to say. And it's kind of, it makes me think of a young person who was just recent graduate of high school, and who told me a story of how one of her friends, a male friend, chose to wear a crop top to school just to see what would happen. Because apparently girls weren't allowed to wear it, and he just wanted to find out what would happen if I did, and apparently nothing at all. In fact, teachers gave him compliments, thought it was funny, thought it was like this bold gesture somehow, but there was no visit to the office, there was no expectation to change, nobody really cared, and it just really highlighted for me like what we're really talking about is the sexualization of female identifying students. And then kind of the other side of it too is in thinking about queer students whose gender expression isn't necessarily what adults think it ought to be. That has a different kind of huge ramification in terms of dress code too. In your experience, have you seen schools work with that at all in any kind of different ways?
Well, I think one of the important aspects of this is the way kids show up at places like prom or dances or things like that. And in the queer community, in the trans community, there is this, that is considered gender affirming care, how a child gets dressed. So it's very important to understand that when we're talking to our queer students, when we're talking to our trans students, we need to, again, I think, as you put it so well, care a little bit less to enhance our desire to support the mental health of a student in our school. Gender affirming care has nothing to do with surgery. 95% of the time, it's got nothing to do with surgery. We've just, again, the debate in this country has been so contextualized and so, part of our culture wars that somehow gender affirming care for young kids has something to do with surgery. And 95% of gender affirming care has nothing to do with surgery. It has to do with how a kid makes their hair, how a kid dresses every day, how they feel comfortable coming to school. And I don't understand, again, why we're policing that. I really don't understand. I don't see why that's important to us.
Nobody's learning has been affected because somebody else chose to wear clothing that somebody else didn't like. And in fact, Correct. It's kind of goofy to think that. Well, I really appreciate these thoughts and just taking a look at things from a policy level. And especially when we think about, if we're taking a look at different schools' dress codes, and they could be pages and pages and pages long. What if they just weren't? I mean, what might happen if we just didn't have a dress code? I think that would be something to actually consider. Well, so Jason, actually, I had a different kind of a thought for how we might end the show, but I'm thinking about this right now. And we'll take a break. And when we come back, I really do want to have this conversation on why two white cis men get to have this conversation about gender at all, if that's all right.
That's great. I love it.
I feel like we have to address that before putting this video out. So, all right. Well, so let's go ahead and we'll take a quick break. And then when we come back, let's talk about, why is it, that someone who looks like Jason and Tim are having this conversation about gender equity in schools from both kind of that foundational implicit bias level and at the policy level as well. Well, welcome back. Jason, it has just been absolutely fantastic to talk to you today. And just given all the ground that we've covered, one final thought that I'm having right now that I feel we absolutely have to address is why are two white cis men having this conversation about gender at all? Like, are there voices that we are simply just not including and really need to have this conversation effectively?
Yeah. So, Tim, I'm going to add something else in there. White cisgender 58-year-old man, right? I'm a end of baby boomer, beginning of the Gen Xers. I mean, you'd think on some level I'm the last person to be having this conversation in a certain way. And I'll tell you that one of the things that has become very interesting to me is that my own understanding, by diving into this more deeply, my own understanding of my own gender identity has changed over the years, and I will say for the better. So this has been a self-improvement project as well as something about schools and education. But one of the things I think is really important to contextualize is, Tim, we all have gender experiences and identity stories and ways in which we frame our own identity stories we go through life. There's no escaping that. That's just part of the human experience. So it's very important for us as people who can understand that and see that to be allies with children who, as they're developing and experimenting and thinking about who they are, that they understand that that's completely okay. That journey is a completely okay one, and it's going to change over time. It's not going to be the same. You're going to contextualize that story differently. The other point that I'd like to put out here, which you kind of mentioned in the beginning, which I think is super important, is that there are intersectional issues here which we must keep into account when we talk about this. Mm-hmm. The way I describe it is that when we talk about discipline in particular, that gender is kind of like the baseline inequity that gets established because it's so common to everybody's experiences. It was also in human history. The first form of inequity that we had was between gender. okay? How women were viewed as secondary citizens, as property in all sorts of ways. And that was like the, standard bearer for inequity for a very long time. What it does is when we add race into it, when we talk about the experience of Black children in schools in particular, but also brown children as well, right? Kids who come from immigrant homes, from Latino homes. What happens is race issues exponentialize discipline problems for kids who are Black, who are Latino, and they face much worse consequences because of it, right? Where boys might be seen as discipline problems, young Black boys are viewed in the light of criminality. Mm-hmm. Okay? It's like taken to an extreme, right? That their road somehow is going from school to jail. And we know about that pipeline and how it works. But part of that is not just an issue of race. Part of it is also an issue at the beginning of how we contextualize the experience of boys, mm-hmm. right? So they get caught up in a much worse kind of conundrum. And so do Black girls as well in schools. And we should recognize that. Where, we can do what we talked about before, which is the sexualization of women's bodies in schools. For Black girls, that becomes their entire narrative. They're viewed as over-sexualized, that they're going to become pregnant early, that their schooling doesn't matter as much. And they have to fight against these stereotypes constantly about who they are and who they want to become. And Latino students talk about the very same thing. They talk about the inequity in how they are viewed in schools, and the baseline is gender. But then everything spins out of control for these people when we incorporate the race card into it.
And so just one of the things then that is kind of coming to mind is that why is it that two white cisgendered men are having this conversation at all? It kind of comes down to a different experience that I had where I was pulled over in a car with a group of friends, and I was the only white person in it, and I was driving, and I asked the officer, I really did not understand why I was getting pulled over at all, and all of the friends in the car was, "Tim, shut up." And in that moment, I realized for the first time in my life that I was white. Like that was, oh, that's me. Like that's me. Like I have a race too, and perhaps the reason why cisgendered men need to be talking about issues of gender is that we really don't. We don't have those conversations, and when we don't, we are the ones who are more likely to be recreating the inequities in our school systems than anyone else. I mean, how might you react to that?
Well, Tim, I think you contextualize it perfectly, right? What you're not aware of and what you're not pushing back on, you're reinforcing and reestablishing. I don't think there's any question about that. And so one of the things that's super important for people, for you and me, is that we have to understand that we have to be interrupters and disruptors of those conversations. Yeah. That has to be our role. And we have to take that on with a kind of seriousness that when you're in the car, you're both respecting your friends who are in that position. But if your friend was the one who was driving that car on that day, that you would feel comfortable first not putting him into a dangerous situation, but also you'd be willing to step up and push back if anything really atrocious took place. You'd be willing to say something and establish it. And a pastor friend of mine who works at the First AME here in Los Angeles, one of the things he said to me, I asked him once about 20 years ago, I said, John, what do I need to do? How do I become a good ally? And he said, Jason, you're not a good ally because we have a relationship. You're a good ally because when you're in relationship with people who look like you and talk like you, when they say something racist or they say something sexist, you're willing in that moment to say that's not okay. And I'm not going to tolerate that from the people around me, that I'm not going to allow the best of friends, even though they might have the best of intentions. They have to understand that those conversations are not off limits, that I'm going to be a disruptor. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's super, super important.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that a ton. And Jason, I thank you for being here today. And I just thank you for sharing your experience, your work, your research with our listeners. And to everyone listening to, I hope you enjoyed our show. And I hope you reach out to me and to Jason with your final thoughts on our conversation. You can find Jason. Jason, what's your email? How can people email you if they got any questions?
They can email me at hello@ablineducation.com.
hello@ablineducation.com. So that's hello@ablineducation.com. And do me a favor real quick. Can you tell me again the title of your book and where they can find it?
Absolutely. So the title of my book is The Gender Equation in Schools: How to Create Equity and Fairness for All Students. And it's out by Routledge Press, and you can find it on Amazon. You can also, it has an audio version for all of you audio freaks out there who love to listen to books, or you can get the regular tried and true traditional version of the book right here. Or you can go to the Routledge website, and you can also order it there on the audio version and the paperback version as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I appreciate you, Jason, very much for being on the show today. And if your listeners, you want to find me, I'm at www.tgseducationalconsulting.com. And if you're a school leader and you're experiencing some success in establishing equity and addressing equity in schools, please let me know. Drop a comment on what you're up to. Until next time, may all of us have as many opportunities to be as good and generous to ourselves as we are with those we serve.